In this lecture, I want to discuss one of the most important philosophers who's still working, still alive. His work ranges over many areas in social theory. It ranges in areas of philosophy, linguistics, and so on. And that's Jürgen Habermas. Habermas is one of the last great defenders of rationalism in a period in philosophy in which rationalism is not held in very high esteem. In many ways, Habermas is an outgrowth of one of the figures that we discussed last time, namely Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School. That would include Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Habermas was, in fact, Adorno's graduate assistant. And so the original project that Jürgen Habermas set himself was to reformulate the kinds of theories being worked on by Marcuse, by Horkheimer, and by Adorno. In particular, his first venture was to reformulate their distinction between traditional theory, understood as both philosophy and science, both, as opposed to what they called critical theory, a theory whose interest was in the emancipation of human beings. Now, this may sound a little sort of fancy Dan. The whole attempt was a way to attempt to reformulate Marxism in a setting appropriate for the late 20th century. So this is a very important school of thinkers, of which Habermas is, in a way, the last and leading exponent. It's clear, I mean, and especially in his later work, that he's moved a considerable distance away from Marxism. That would be obvious, I think, for almost any thinker in the late 20th century. What I want to do is to start and move you through in 45 minutes from Marcuse's rather exuberant radicalism, his youthful radicalism. I want to move from there through Habermas's attempt to reformulate that project while keeping in mind our central theme, which is the self under siege. I mean, what was important to Marcuse about social systems was not what would be important to the average economist, which was, maximizing utilities. What was important to Marcuse about economies and other things was their effect on the lives of selves. How did they cause the self to be able to construct itself? In other words, how was the economic and cultural impact of that lived out in human beings? And I discussed a whole series of pathologies of both the period in which he wrote and that pathologies that have continued down to the present day. So that was Marcuse's interest, was in liberating people from that unnecessary part of life suffering. Not death, I mean, I think again, I don't think we can get around that. But there's a vast difference between living to be 90 and being well-educated and fed and relatively healthy, and dying at the age of 3 weeks in Biafra with flies in your eyes. There's a significant difference there, a difference that people have found worth fighting over and worth dying for. So Habermas attempts to reformulate this project. He begins with a distinction that's central throughout his early work between labor and what he initially called interaction, but which I think can safely be called by now communication. And his argument was a fundamental argument. He said, if you look at the human species, it has fundamental human interests. One is to reproduce its life through labor. In other words, through work. That's a fundamental interest of the human species. You don't do that one, and sort of nothing else gets off the ground. It's a fundamental human interest. Habermas locates a second fundamental human interest, and this one is different, quite different for him, in communication. In other words, in the interest that human beings have, and it's a deeply seated interest, in communicating with one another. If you think about this, it would be required for everything from any kind of social bonding, without which even human life in the anthropological sense wouldn't be possible, and so on. It's a fundamental interest, not just in communication, this is important, but in undistorted and clear communication. That's our fundamental human interest. Because we have a fundamental human interest in undistorted communication, we need to understand what Habermas calls systematically distorted communication. And I will be on to that in just a minute. First, I want to briefly lay aside the part of the older critical theory and of Marx that Habermas leaves alone as he reformulates his project. The labor half of the distinction is pretty much left over to the standard economic accounts that grow out of his tradition in the early Habermas. Labor is understood as a kind of monological or instrumental endeavor. You know, in other words, it's an instrumental endeavor driven by the imperatives of efficiency and so on. It's an instrumental endeavor, and he defines it as being monological. He also says about it something that's sort of banally true. He calls it a productive endeavor. It's the endeavors surrounding production as opposed to those surrounding communication. Communication is, according to Habermas, by its very nature, dialogic, okay? And what Habermas wants to locate, because he knows that there are traditional disciplines throughout the history of Western or Indo-European societies and Western civilization that deal with problems both in the area of labor and communication. So I say in the area of labor and instrumental reason, we have the sciences, and in the area of communication, we have the humanities, which are supposed to enlighten us about dialogue, tell us more about how to talk to one another. For Habermas, we really form ourselves as selves in both dimensions. But we could not, for Habermas, possibly become subjects, selves, without the communicative dimension of dialogue. So he would utterly reject a sort of empiricist account like David Hume would give, or like Skinner in a more modern period would give, that we could become human simply by looking at patches of blue and listening to pieces of phonetic sounds. Because for him, we become selves in much the way we do for Mead, the great American sociologist. We become selves in our interaction with other selves. In other words, it's by seeing how other people respond to the things that we say that we cue in on who we are. We may adjust it and so on. I mean, this seems to me, at one level, an obvious point. I mean, this seems to me obvious, but you'd be surprised it's not obvious in philosophy. Now, the most controversial part of the early Habermas's work is his claim that the human race has a third interest. And of course, his whole argument will hinge on this. And that's the critical interest in emancipation. That the human race really has an interest that's fundamental. By that he means an interest that's so important that we need it in order to survive. To free ourselves from both the distortions of instrumental reason and the distortions of what could be called, and will later in his work be called, communicative reason. We need to free ourselves from these distortions. In other words, for the human race to survive, we need to learn to labor more humanely to the extent that we can manage that. And we all, in the focus of his early work, perhaps more important still, we need to be able to communicate with one another freely and clearly, and that without doing so, our chances of a long survival are not great. So throughout this work, you can see in a way that we have first a reformulation of a kind of Marxian side of the account of human beings in Habermas's labor part of the distinction. Now, for his communication model, we have what I would call a hermeneutic base for it. By hermeneutic here, again, I mean interpretive. And the philosopher he discusses, Dilthey and others, where he says the great art of the humanities, if you will, the way they further communication, is through the interpretation of texts.